أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري يا إلهي خذ
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we will be talking about sukuk. I believe that we must have heard about sukuk at one point or the other. Sukuk, it's an Arabic word and it just means certificate. And it is part of the most significant, or it is one of the most significant innovation and contribution of Islamic finance to the financial markets. In simple terms, it is compared, for people to understand, it is compared with bonds. I believe some of us, or most of us that have participated in the financial markets at one point or the other, we must have heard of shares, stocks, and bonds. So sukuk is very much similar to bonds, although there are differences, and we'll get to that in a bit. It represents, in simple terms, sukuk represents ownership interest of the sukuk holder or the certificate holder in an underlying asset or underlying venture or business. So when you have, just like a share certificate, it's an evidence that you own shares in that company. For sukuk, the certificate is an evidence that you own interest in the assets that is underlying the sukuk, and it entitles you, the certificate holder, to share in the profits underlying assets or venture. Compared with bonds and shares in many respects, and it can also be compared with a mutual fund in some aspects, but more importantly, it is compared with bonds. And we look at bonds, and to help us to understand what sukuk is, let us compare it with bonds. When government issue bonds, it represents a debt obligation of the government. Corporate can also issue bonds, whether national, like the federal government, or state governments can issue bonds or sukuk. Whoever the issuer is, bond, when it is issued, represents an IOU, for example, a debt obligation of the issuer. But sukuk represents ownership interest, not a debt obligation, but ownership interest of the certificate holder in the underlying assets. Sukuk, for you to issue a sukuk, it is a condition precedent that you have to state the purpose, the use of proceeds, what you want to use the sukuk for. And it is investors, it is ownership of underlying assets by the investors that entitles them to the return from that sukuk. So if the investors do not own the underlying asset of the sukuk in one form or the other, it means they will not be entitled in a Sharia manner to earn return from that underlying asset. And another important feature of sukuk is that it is all encompassing, in the sense that it accommodates both conventional and non-conventional investors. So whether you believe in the prohibition against interest, or you don't believe in it, you can invest in sukuk. While for conventional bonds, it's a bit restrictive, in the sense that it is only those people that do not care or believe in the prohibition of interest can invest in bonds. But sukuk, whether it encompasses every and all kinds of investors. More importantly, The underlying asset of a sukuk has to be Sharia compliant. I've mentioned earlier that you need to disclose what you want to do with the sukuk, with the process of the sukuk issuance, and investors have to take ownership of that underlying asset in one form or the other. Then an important condition is that that underlying asset has to be something that is Sharia compliant. So what does this mean? It means, for example, that you cannot raise sukuk to go and build a brewery. For example, it means that you cannot raise sukuk to go and establish a gambling house. For example, it means that you cannot raise sukuk and use it as a capital contribution to a conventional bank, for example. So all the process of the sukuk has to be deployed in a manner that is Sharia compliant. One other important feature of sukuk is that it has a governance framework that ensures that the money is deployed for the purpose for which it is raised. So, for example, you have a trustee who monitors the use of the proceeds of the sukuk. It is very important, unlike a conventional bond, that yes, you can have that, but it is not a condition precedent for the validity of that conventional bond. So you also have a certification by a Sharia board, and the Sharia board are the ones who look at the documents of the sukuk and say the process, the documentation itself is clear enough, the process to which the sukuk will be deployed is clear enough, and then we certify that the sukuk is Sharia compliant. So that Sharia certificate is critical to the validity of a sukuk. Without it, you cannot successfully launch a sukuk in the public sphere, for instance. That is not the same with conventional bond, where once you package the instrument and investors are happy with the credit rating of the issuer, for example, because again, it's a debt obligation. Once they are happy with the credit rating and they are sure that you can pay them, they will give you their money, and it is just a debt and credit obligation. One other feature is that sukuk has different types. So depending on the type of the sukuk, for example, you can have a lease-based sukuk, which means that the underlying asset is being leased from the subscribers or the investors by the issuer. You can also have non-lease-based sukuk, a musharaka sukuk or a mudaraba sukuk, which is more of equity partnership in one way or the other that is linked to a specific project. So in project financing, you can do that, whereby invite subscription from investors who subscribed to the sukuk. For example, you want to build a tolled road, so you can analyze the cash flow from the toll that you will get from people plying the route, and you can use that to sort of estimate to investors or pitch to investors that's the kind of return they should be expecting. So that kind of sukuk, the value can increase or decrease because it's an equity-based kind of sukuk. That is not typical in a conventional bond because, as we've explained earlier, it is just a debt obligation of the issuer. We'll stop it right there, and I wish to thank you very much for listening to us. We believe that you benefited from it, and we pray Allah to grant us good understanding of it, and forgive the speaker and the listener. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Halima Ahmad. Thank you for joining me on this edition of Knowing the Dawah Institute. Now, here we are to meet with the Director of Research and Training of the Dawah Institute. So, we would like to know about the activities of the Research and Training Unit.
The Research and Training Unit, or department of the Dawah Institute, is the department responsible for keeping, so to speak, its finger on the pulse of the Muslim community, to try and see what are the problems out there. So we conduct surveys, we conduct interviews to try and see what are the trending challenges that Muslims who are involved in da'wah are facing, Islamic organizations are facing, various groups within the Muslim Ummah are facing. Conduct research to see how we can produce training material, resources, media content to address these issues, especially within the Muslim community. We try to make sure these courses are the best possible courses that we can offer. So we ensure that we have the highest standards of facilitators, the best material. So this costs money, of course. Accommodation costs money, feeding costs money, and all that goes into organizing a good quality course. So it does cost. But what we also try to do is get sponsors, people who can fund, who can support, donors who can sponsor. All the courses are available offline, and people come either here to Mina, to the Da'wah Institute, where we have all the facilities to conduct the training programs. So we would prefer some courses to be offline because of the amount of interaction, but some courses seem to be successfully conducted online with a combination of Zoom and other online facilities.
Thank you very much for your time, and we would be meeting with the next person shortly.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Ndako Mijindadi. I'm the head of investments at Lotus Capital Limited. Today, I'd like to do something a bit personal and tell us how to prepare our personal family budgets. We had mentioned previously that one of the good ways of being financially intelligent is to have a good plan, so here's me telling you some of the things that I put in my own personal budgets, and hopefully, it might be beneficial to you as well, right? So first things is to decide how frequently you want to have a budget, and most times is dependent on how your income is structured. So I earn money monthly, so I keep a monthly budget. But it's also possible for you to have a weekly budget, it's possible for you to have an annual budget, whichever one works for you. So let's just assume that we're using a monthly budget for ease of preparation. You might wonder that, if you have a monthly budget, what do I do if I have some expenses that are still made monthly, like my rent, for instance? It's very simple. So all you need to do is, if you have something that's just one or two things that you do spend on an annual basis, you can simply divide that amount by 12 and then make provision for it on a monthly basis. So it's quite simple to do. Right, so let's jump in. So what are the things that I put in my own monthly budget that potentially you can put in your own monthly budget? The first one, for me, is charity. Yep. So I feel like whenever you do get money, it's important that you plan to show appreciation to Allah for giving you this money by giving some amount of it out in charity. So decide what is comfortable for you to give out on a consistent basis, and pen down into your monthly budget some amount for charity, and that would be beneficial, inshallah. The second thing that I put into my budget is education. And this is not just education for my kids in terms of school fees, so it's also payment for madrasa, for instance, all the types of education that is important to you. And we should understand that education, at least for our children, is the best legacy that we can leave for them. So it should be one of the things that ranks very high on your budget. I'd like to encourage us that when we're making provision for education expenses, we always try and aim for high quality schools or high quality teachers. It will be very, very useful for our children and for us as well. So there you have it. So the first thing was charity. And the second thing that I have in my own budget, and maybe you should too, is education. Now, the third thing that I put in my budget is my rent, right? And why would rent come third? Well, you see, rent is one of the biggest expenses that most people are likely to have. So I can give us a rule of thumb. You can say, I don't want my rent to be more than 30% of my annual income, for instance, right? And then just make a provision for that on a monthly basis. It's good that you don't put too much money aside for rent, or you don't ensure, or you try and make sure that rent doesn't take too much of your income, because we should all be trying to own our homes one day, so there should be a bit of a buffer that you can put aside to eventually, one day owning a home. And you don't want anything to happen to your income and affect your ability to pay your rent, so always try and live within your means. All right. So the third thing will be, at least for me, my rent. Yeah. And the fourth thing that I put in my budget is feeding. Now, this is a bit tricky because, what I eat and what you eat or what other people eat might be different, right? I might have different preferences and different tastes, and so it might be a bit tricky, but no problem. I think the thing to focus on is that you should make a provision for feeding, and that should be based on what you consider to be nourishing food. Now, nourishing food is usually affordable. So when you're making provisions, it should be for things like water as opposed to soft drinks, right? It should be for things like meat as opposed to corned beef. It should be for things like fish as opposed to sardines, or things like this. It should be for cooking at home as opposed to eating in a restaurant. So if you can just have your feeding budget for something nourishing and basic, you should be fine. If there's surpluses, then you can take, other kind of food items, okay? So for me, the next thing is feeding. Once I'm done with feeding, I move to my overheads, right? Now, what are overheads? These are the typical things that can pop up, and really mess up your finances in the course of the month, like repairs in your home, gas, your electricity bill, your petrol, right, for your car, for transportation. So it's good to quantify these things and make a provision for it, at least for me, on a monthly basis. And the good thing about overheads is if you ever have any kind of financial constraint, God forbid, overheads are the easiest place to cut in your budget, right? So you can decide to say, oh, look, I'm not going to use a generator today so I can save some money on petrol, or I'm going to go to work with my friends so I don't have to drive. The different things you can do with your overhead budget, just so you can, manage your monthly expenses. So for me, one of the things that I put in my budget, and I encourage you to also put in your budget, is provision for overheads. Now, after that, I make provision for clothing, right? And it's easy if people have some kind of tight finances to forget about their clothing. But I think it's very important that we, give some attention to how we adorn ourselves, right? And obviously, as Muslims, it's also very important that we look the part and we look smart and we look clean, right? So it's important that we take this seriously, almost like a religious obligation, to put some money aside and make provision for our clothing. Now, it doesn't have to be for buying new clothes. It can just be for a laundry person to make sure your clothes are looking nice and good, right? So put some provision in your monthly budget for clothing. The other thing that I can advise, which I do, and hopefully you can, is to make provision for recreation, right? Now, and what I mean by recreation is you can add gifts to this. So make provision to spend some money on yourself, on relaxation, on buying gifts for your wife, for your kids. I know we feel sometimes, as people that earn money and spend a lot on our family, sometimes we feel, oh, the fact that I bought gas or I paid the electricity bill, everybody should be happy and my kids should jump up. I can tell you for free, nobody's children are going to go, yay, daddy bought gas. Nobody's going to do that, right? So please, once in a while, buy them a toy, right? And reduce the anxiety in the house. So make some provisions in your monthly budget for recreation, for gifts, and the likes. Now, the other thing that I put in my budget, and I'd advise people, is to make provisions for travel. Right? And travel can be provisions for pilgrimage. So if you haven't already been for Hajj, or if you want to go on Umrah, right, try and put some money aside and plan towards it. It's a big expense, right? So you want to do it in small doses and take it step by step. And little drops will make an ocean. So please don't think any amount is too small. Make some provision for that journey of a lifetime, Umrah, Hajj, any other kind of journey to Masjid al-Aqsa, if that's what you want to do. But please take it seriously. Another thing that I put in my budget, I try to keep some money for my retirement, right? So I'm making money today. I might not always be strong enough to make money. I might be out of a job for whatever reason, God forbid, but it's important that we put aside some money for those kind of eventualities, for our retirement and things like that, no matter how small. Please always make some provision for a day when you will no longer be making steady income, right? Another thing that you should make provisions for is for medical expenses. Now, take care of your health. Make sure you're healthy, your family is healthy, you're eating well, you're sleeping well, you have good routines, right? But it's also possible that even when you do these things, you might once in a while take ill. You don't want your medical situation to wipe out all your resources. So it's very important that when you do make income, you keep some money aside for potential medical expenses. Now, it's okay if you've written down all these things and made all this provision, and by the time you look at your sheet or you look at your paper, you realize that, oh my God, my income is not enough to cover my budget, right? So that can happen. Take it easy, that can happen. Just remember that, even Nigeria, our budget is bigger than our revenue, right? So the most important thing when this happens is to try and think about things that you can do to make additional income to cover your budget. And where you realize that you can't make that additional income, then you can trim various areas of your budget, okay? Inshallah, I hope this talk has been very beneficial and everybody today can start keeping a budget and we're able to manage our finances better. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.